And in every time, in every crisis, people talk about the crisis ad nauseum, right? I mean, just all you hear about is the crisis, right? Then people start talking about post crisis. Post pandemic was like a buzz term. But what nobody talks about is the period post crisis. In this case, the period post pandemic. That actually is the most tender point there is. And we're in it right now.
You're listening to Prospecting on Purpose, where we discuss all things prospecting, sales, business, and mindset. I'm your host, Sara Murray, a sales champion who's here to show you that you can be a shark in business and still lead with intentionality and authenticity. Tune in each week as we dive into methods to connect with clients, communicate with confidence, and close the deal. Jeffrey Shaw is a small business coach, brand management consultant, keynote speaker, TEDx speaker, and the author of Lingo and the Self-Employed Life. He supports self-employed business owners with strategies that they need to create sustainable success. Jeff is also the host of The Self-Employed Life, which is amongst the top 15% of all podcasts. I am personally a big fan of his, and I am so honored to have Jeff on the show today. Welcome to Prospecting on Purpose.
Hey, Sarah, I'm glad to be here with you.
Well, I did give Jeff a heads up on his icebreaker question because it is a little bit of a thinker. It takes some more time, but it is really fun. My question to you, Jeff, is who are 3 fictional characters who make up your personality?
Yeah, well, I learned a lot about myself asking myself this question. So number one would be Mr. Rogers, in part because I am absolutely a cardigan wearing nerd. But also, and I think it has a lot to do with the conversation we're going to have today. I think he represents, especially today, kind of a return to like basic values. I think we're going to hopefully over the next couple of years uncomplicate the world. And I think this is a great opportunity to return to the basic values. Please, remember to say please and thank you, like some of the basics. And I love that he represents that. The second fictional character would be Winnie the Pooh. I have a stuffed Winnie the Pooh. Like I love Winnie the Pooh. Such an old soul, and the quotes, like Poohisms, those quotes that come out. I can really resonate. I love most of the quotes, but I'm just a huge quote lover. I always say that when I'm gone, my greatest thrill will be that my kids will come across some crap that their father said on the internet, like some quote. Like that's my dream. And the last one is definitely a different one, but Wile E. Coyote. And I thought about this a lot. But why did Wile E. Coyote pop into my mind? Because he's kind of an antagonist, and he's not necessarily the best figure. But I can remember being a kid, really relating to his persistence, and I realized that's so much a part of my personality. Like he was just going at it all the time, regardless of the outcome, and getting beat up by the Roadrunner. And so, yeah. So there are my 3. I'm not sure what it says about me collectively, but there you go.
Oh, that's so good. Wildly Coyote is a little bit of a plot twist there
Yeah,
between Mr. Rogers and Pooh, but
I
I
know.
appreciated it. We all need a little bit of a bad boy, right?
Exactly. I think I am a little of a plot twist. I think a lot of us are.
Well, see, that was a great quote that your kids can pull from. I'm a bit of a plot twist. I appreciate you taking the time to think about it and share with us because it helps kind of, I think, craft your personality for us a little bit more too. So, Jeff, I did read your book, The Self-Employed Life, and in it you tell a great story about how your career started, your self-employed career started as a photographer, and you have an awesome prospecting story. So I would love to start there.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, first of all, it struck me. I mean, honestly, just a few years ago. Now, mind you, I've been in business now for nearly 40 years. In one form of business, I could just say been self-employed, and I didn't think that was peculiar until I was at a dinner party, maybe only about 3 years ago. I was at a dinner party, and the topic came up that I've never had a traditional job. I've never received a paycheck, and everybody else at the table thought that was so odd. And in fact, somebody said to me, "Do you use that in your keynotes?" I'm like, "No. Is it interesting?" Like, I didn't, when you've never had a traditional job or received a paycheck, like the fact I've been self-employed my entire life didn't seem interesting to me until I realized it was. And I realized that part of what made it interesting is that there's a world of self-employed people out there that may not be getting advice that's really applicable to them. So the story I share in the book, now mind you, I am early 20s at this point. I remember being about 3 years into business. I started out as a photographer at 20 years old, and I was about 3 years into business, which was not going well. It was really a struggling business. I was reinventing myself, rebranding, and building a business for a client, a very high-end clientele, because I realized that's what I had done wrong. When I started out initially, I went back to my hometown, which is a very, lower middle class type of community. And there was, no matter what sales words, phrases, clever things I had learned from salesmanship 101, no matter what I did, there was no getting anybody to buy what I had to offer. And I realized the problem was a misalignment of values. You can't make people who are struggling to pay their rent or their mortgage, you can't, no matter what you say or do, you can't make them see value in a luxury item. And a photograph is a luxury item. So I realized that I needed to find people that were luxury buyers, and that led me to an understanding that I needed to find people with discretionary income, therefore affluent people. So one of the first things in the story that you're referring to that I did in the book was I took it upon myself to try to figure out how to get find my way into one of the most exclusive country clubs, not just in the area, but really in the United States, Westchester Country Club. I think the PGA Tour has been there, and it's just a really exclusive club. And it's a dining club, a golf club, and residents, and very large community of residences live there. So I figured, these were my people, and I just wanted to make myself known. So I somehow, first of all, I went to the store and I quote unquote bought a sport coat because I didn't own one, but I left the tags on because I knew I'd be returning it afterwards because I'm a broke 23-year-old. So remarkably, this is a gated community, and the guard at the gate let me through, and to this day, I don't know why. And I think that I must have just looked like hired help or something. I'm not sure why I was allowed to get through this gate in the first place, but I did. So now I headed to the country club, and again, I walk into the country club, and there's a receptionist, and I asked her if I could speak to the club manager. Again, without a whole lot of questions as to why, she got up and went to the office of the club manager, and he came out to speak with me. I'm again not sure why she didn't just send me away right there. But the club manager comes out, and at 23 years old, he was the exact figure of the type of person that intimidated the heck out of me. Like, this was a middle-aged, white 50-something-year-old guy, like exactly who scared the daylights out of me as a 23-year-old. So I was nervous, but I went on to explain to him why I was there, and I just said, "Look, I'm not asking anything of you. I simply want you to know I exist as a photographer. I suspect we are serving similar clientele. The clientele that attends your club are exactly the people that value what I do as a portrait photographer." And as I'm saying this, I'm taking photographs out of a portfolio and I'm getting ready to show him. I brought beautiful framed photographs. But again, I made it very clear I wasn't asking anything of him. And I wanted him to understand that. I kept saying, I just want you to know I exist, that my services exist. And he was fed up, but polite. So he listened in, whatever. And then when I showed him a couple photographs, he says, okay, he says, thank you for coming in. It was a very polite send off. Thank you for coming in, blah, blah, blah. And I had left him, I think, business cards. 2 days later, I got a phone call from this club manager who I suspect probably rarely made calls himself, right? So he calls me, and he said, "Young man, I don't know what you're up to, but keep doing it." He says, "In my 25 years or something, in my 25 years of managing this club, not once has someone ever come into my office and asked me if I knew a portrait photographer because they were having a family reunion at the club." He says, 2 days, right? He says, "The woman just left, a member just left my office, asking me if I knew of a photographer. And of course, I just met you 2 days ago." So that's what he said. He goes, "Young man, I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing it." And I can honestly say I've pretty much built my businesses on this idea that, first of all, you don't ever know what's going to come from something. The fact of the matter is, and I think the more profound thing to understand about business here is that I will bet you that he has been asked many times if he knew of a photographer for one occasion or another. And because nobody came to mind, he just naturally said no. By my showing up just letting him know I existed, I was top of mind when somebody, and that to me is one of the most basic lessons we can learn in business and sales is to show up and be top of mind. You don't know where things are going to lead, but I can guarantee I have built businesses on understanding that concept. That first of all, there's a philosophical and almost spiritual component to that, which is, but it's actually also a scientific component. It's called brain priming. You can only recognize what you already know. So the reason he was able to recognize that he knew a photographer was because he had just met me. And it was his brain was primed for recognition. Just knowing that part of your goal in marketing is to prime people to recognize you.
I love the story. It's such a clever and creative way to prospect for business is just getting over that fear of just trying something. And I feel like when you think about your 5 minutes of discomfort with this general manager at this country club, that 5 minutes of discomfort led to an entire Rolodex of clients and decades of business because you were brave enough to get through it. And what I think is really important to know is that you made him more valuable to his clients too,
Mhm.
right? You mentioned you have mutual clientele, similar alignment of values, what type of product or service you're offering to them. You're making him more valuable too. I feel for people listening to this, getting over that little bit of fear, you're adding value to the prospect that you're approaching too, right? Value is important, but it elevates them. And so it gives you that courage and momentum that you need to go after the next 5 minutes of discomfort.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up actually, because I did go on to do a lot of work at that country. I mean, it became the residential area of that club became one of my primary markets. So it built onto much bigger things. But to your point, it was it in the end, and hey, there was no commission involved, nothing like that, no kickback, nothing like that. But in the end, he became a valuable resource to his members because he knew somebody that could fulfill normal life events, weddings, family reunions, family portraits, holiday cards, right? So he became a valuable resource. So in a way, I elevated his value to his members by being a resource for him to refer to.
It's such a powerful lesson. And so then why did you pivot from a successful photography business to becoming this real like leader and champion of the self-employed?
Oh, and sometimes I still wonder. I get asked that all the time because it's, in part because I think it just strikes people really odd. Like, how did you go from photographer to author and speaker? Where to me, like for many of us, it doesn't seem at all odd to me because our life is just a series of dots, and these dots come along in our lives and in a slower pace, and we're just following the dots. So to me, it makes perfect sense. The real answer, and again, people have asked me, particularly people that know me as a photographer, they ask me, did you get bored? The fact of the matter is, it was even when I really started pulling back from doing much photography, it's been 15 years now that I really, it's after 25 years of 100% being a photographer, for the past 15 years or so, I've been really pulling back and doing less and less of it. And even at the time when I started kind of rewinding the volume of business I did as a photographer, it was a very successful, thriving photography business. So it
Mhm.
seems stupid, right? But here's the overriding reason is I felt complete.
Mm.
And I just think it goes against our human nature and certainly goes against the nature of Wile E. Coyote, to not just wanting to explore and to go further. And I just felt complete as a photographer. I never got bored. I've always loved it. I just didn't. I'd already accomplished more than I'd ever imagined I would when I set out, and I just didn't. I wasn't driven by growth.
Mm.
And when that's lacking in any area of life, I have to shift and find an area of growth. And it was already at that time. And again, I think it ties into something else I often teach and talk about, which is to follow what's unfolding. It's one thing we can be goal oriented in business and in life, and we need to be. But I'm also more so today than ever a huge proponent of follow what's unfolding, so that we don't miss opportunities because we don't know what's going to unfold in front of us. And at the point that I started feeling the inkling to do something else, which by the way is the same inkling corporate people feel often, right? They have a good steady job, they have security, but they have an inkling to do something else. It was really for me almost no different. And at that point, if I followed what was unfolding, I was already getting inquiries to speak. I was already getting inquiries to coach. So the seeds were planted and I just went for it. And so for the past 15 years, I look at, and what I teach in my business institute is to look at your business model as a series of levers. So I started pulling back the lever of photography and lifting up the lever of business coach, and just kind of allowed those ships to pass in the night. And now I can also say I'm 100%. My income comes from coaching, consulting, speaking, etc.
Do you have a favorite out of your levers? Like, what would you do all day long if you could do one pillar of your business all day?
Yeah, honestly, I do. My Self-Employed Business Institute. Not only just the structure of the institute, but just to me, it is my deepest level of service because it comes from such a place of love for self-employed business owners, which is why I created it. It was a result of my book, The Self-Employed Life. My book had been out for a few months, and I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, not so much about the book, but I was saying to her that in the 12, 13 years at that point that I had been coaching, although I have coached people in all different industries, they all had one thing in common. The one thing they had in common is that they're really good at what they do, but they're in an industry where nobody teaches them how to make money at what they do. Right. And I realized, and this is post pandemic, and I realized how true this was, even becoming more true because people were leaving corporate in droves and leveraging their expertise in an area, right? Like yourself, you leveraging your expertise in sales training. You're clearly a sales expert. You're a prospecting expert, but you didn't go to prospecting on purpose school,
Right.
right? There's no school for you to be good at what you do. There's training in your skill set and there's experience in your skill set, but there's no school to go to figure out how to make money at that skill set.
Right.
And I said this to a friend of mine, and I said, somebody needs to fix this. And she, being the friend she is, she goes, why not you? So that was literally the impetus. Within 2 months, I launched the Self-Employed Business Institute, which is a 5-month curriculum for people from all different industries. But the program is the marketing strategies that are specific to being self-employed, along with a hybrid of one-to-one coaching, so that no matter what industry you're in, you're getting attention and your objectives met by your own individual journey. So that is by far the thing I could do all day long. It's just those are my people, and there is nothing like, to me, the privilege of hanging out with your people all day long.
And I'm sure that creates a sense of community too, because self employed, you are in many cases alone. So now it's almost like you're giving that structure of camaraderie with other folks in the Business Institute.
Yeah, which they need so I mean, they need for each other too, and that's actually one of the reasons why one of the things that I think is super unique about the Business Institute, or what we refer to as alumni benefits. And basically what that is that once you've completed the 5-month program, you can attend all the training calls, the open coaching calls, the guest speakers, the workshops. You can come back to all that you had in the program as often as you want for as long as you want. And I do that because being self-employed by nature is kind of this up and down cycle. And I want self-employed business owners to have a place to go when they're down. I want them to have a place to go when they want new information, when they want relevant information. It's all live. So the education is always going to be evolving in the current business environment. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, community is a huge part of being in business for sure.
And that is definitely what I got out of the book. It's almost like this rally cry, like you're the warrior leader to really go spearhead the small business entrepreneur, self employed person.
Mhm.
One thing that I found really powerful, and it made me think about self employment and small business in different ways, is that you break down the differences between those different words, right? Solopreneurship, entrepreneurship, small business, self employed. Like, there's a lot of terminology that's out there. So, can you orient us a little bit and give us the definitions between those?
Yeah. So the one that really stood out to me is small business because it's so easy to get lumped into the whole, the criteria of being a small business. But the fact of the matter is, the criteria of small business doesn't apply to like 80% of businesses, because you can be considered a small business with up to 500 employees and multi-million dollars in sales. It doesn't represent businesses of one. The reason that's important, for one, is that In the past, for example, during the recession, when there was some level of government aid, it was only available to small businesses, right? So when the pandemic came along, that was one of the first things that occurred to me was my fear that there wasn't going to be any help and support for self-employed business owners. It turned out the PPP loans, as we now know them, that was the first time in US history that the words self-employed were in a piece of legislation. It was the first time in US history that the government recognized the economic impact of self-employed business owners. So there alone, it's super important to me that we make that distinction between calling ourselves small business and referring to ourselves as self-employed. Entrepreneur, again, it's actually to me, it's probably the sexiest of the terms. Like, who doesn't like calling themselves an entrepreneur? But I think you have to be aware that it can have a little bit of a negative connotation today. Entrepreneurship can be associated with hustle and grinding it out in a world where there's a big focus on well-being and balance. So if you refer to yourself as an entrepreneur, somebody might see you as an over-ambitious, grind it out, sleep is for suckers kind of person, which may not be who you are. Solopreneur is my least favorite term, and yet looking at keyword research, it's one of the most common. And the reason I really dislike the term solopreneur and would love for everybody to stop referring to themselves as solopreneur is because none of us are going to get to the level of success we want solo, right? I mean, if you, and to me, my first book called Lingo is about brand messaging, customer facing brand messaging. But I've often thought I should do a follow up book of Lingo, meaning what we say to ourselves and the energy behind the words that we say to ourselves. And if you're referring to yourself as a solopreneur, you are feeling like you're in this alone. More than anything, want people to realize they're not alone. So that's my least favorite, and so that's why I favor self-employed. To me, to refer to yourself as self-employed, you're letting people know your business model, your tax structure, and your life. You're letting people know that you're the type of person that's willing to put your life on the line, and you're the type of person that is building a business and something you're passionate about. So, to me, being self-employed is a badge of honor, and I'd like more people to adopt the terminology.
I appreciate that breakdown because when I think about large corporations, when I think about startups, whether it's more brick and mortar business versus tech and software, the world is changing fast. And even if people are not self employed, but they work for a corporation, they work for a startup, they work for a small business, it's important to understand these different business structures exist because a lot of times the clientele that you're trying to sell to is self employed or a small business. So we may have the resources available to us from a big corporation as a salesperson, but we need to understand the viewpoint, the lens, and the business model of the people that we're selling to. I would be interested in learning from you, Jeff. What are some of the biggest struggles that you see from your clients when it comes to self employment?
Mm. And I just want to back up and reinforce the point you just made. I mean, it's such a critical point. Like, honestly, that'll make any salesperson stand out from everybody else. I mean, your current position might be in a corporate environment, but if your customer is small business, if your customer is self-employed, then you need to shift your manner of speaking to speak their lingo. That I couldn't agree with you more, and it's absolutely critical. Since so many don't, since so many salespeople out there don't, that in itself will make you stand out. I would love for more people to I mean, I have to say I have that argument with technology companies. I mean, there is a certain financial software. I don't want to talk about them, but there's a certain financial software that I've had this conversation with many times. It's like you are not getting the needs, literally not getting the needs of the people you're marketing this product to. Like, you need to hire me as a consultant. They've not done it yet. So that because I can help you understand the lens of your customers. You're marketing to that client base and you actually don't get them. That to me is horrible. It drives me nuts. So love your point. Biggest challenge, and it has everything to do with what you're so good at, prospecting. And it's taken me a long time to kind of really see this as the number one challenge, to the point that I actually did a podcast episode on my own show, calling it out as the number one problem you need to fix. And it is prospecting. What I refer to it actually in my manner of teaching, I teach a system called hug marketing. Okay, so it's a marketing system. And hug marketing is a series of concentric circles. The goal of hug marketing is to take people from the outermost circles one step at a time through, things that you do. I mean, specific actions that you implement. You take people from the outermost circles one step at a time, all the way to what I refer to as a hug client. Okay, the hug client is not just your client; it's somebody that you have built a relationship with. That if you were to see them in person, you couldn't imagine not hugging them. Or a podcast listener. I mean, as I travel throughout the country and I post where I'm traveling, you'd be amazed at how often podcast listeners reach out and say, I saw on social media you're going to be in my city. I would love to meet you. Right? It's a blast. It happens almost every trip I make anywhere in the United States because my show's been around a long time. And there's no way, even though they're a podcast listener and I don't know anything about them, there's no way I can't not hug them when I meet them. There's just something about knowing that they're listening to my show and I'm a hugger. So the biggest challenge I find businesses have is they don't have enough what I refer to as lurkers. Okay, those are the people in the outermost ring. You develop lurkers through, yes, through social media activity. You develop lurkers as you will with your podcast. I mean, that's where most of my lurkers come from is my show. 30,000 people a month listen to my podcast. It's a lot of lurkers. Lurkers are people that are listening to you, reading your content, watching you, but you don't know them by name. You don't even know they're there. I mean, sometimes as a podcast host, without looking at your download stats, you feel like you're yelling into an echo chamber because you don't know who's listening. Those are lurkers. And the reason that's so critical and one of the biggest problems I see business owners having is that they're trying to convert to customers from too small of a number in the first place. Because those lurkers who are passively listening from a distance need to be encouraged to becoming curious about you. Then they need to be encouraged to become engaged with you. Once they become engaged, they need to become connected with you, and then they need to become clients. So, in just the order of trickle down effect, that number of lurkers becomes a very small number to convert to clients. So, if you reverse engineer it, one of the biggest problems businesses have is they don't have a broad enough net of prospecting to begin with, and they're trying to convert customers from too small of a number.
Wow. Well, I know that I discovered you and your podcast by hearing you as a guest on Ashley Gordon's podcast, Badass Manifester. And it was interesting because the things that you were saying resonated with me. They were very aligned with my values and where I wanted to take my business, and that's what led me to your podcast. And then now I'm a lurker, and now you're on my podcast. So it really is just such a cool web of connectivity and following what's unfolding, to use your quote from earlier. And I know that when we meet in person, Jeff, we will be hugging for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, I like maximize your lurkers. I think that's going to be one of my favorite quotes from you.
Also make a good t-shirt. I might have to look into that.
Right? Maximize your lurkers.
It's a little creepy, but I like it. There's the Wile E. Coyote, a little, contradictory. I like that. I like it.
I like that a lot because it's one of the scarier things for people to do. It's difficult to put yourself out there in any type of sales role or social media. You really have to understand your client's business model or your prospect's business model, and then make sure that you're speaking the same lingo, because people want to work with people that they feel understands them. And I think you do such a good job of that with your clientele, and what you have built is so
Yeah, and you have to
impressive.
stick with it. That's the thing with like,
Right.
people that give up on any social media platform like within 3 weeks because they didn't get immediate feedback. Well, because building a portfolio of lurkers takes time. You just have to stick with it. And certainly, I mean, the average podcast, I don't know if the statistic is still true, but it's held up for a long time. The average podcast lasts 7 episodes.
I think I've heard 10, but 7 might be more accurate.
Yeah, I mean, because people don't realize how challenging it is and they get discouraged by the fact that they don't feel like anybody's listening. Hey, nobody was listening to my show when I first started either, but 850 something episodes later in 8 years, then you realize, holy crap, people are listening to this thing. Right. But it takes a long time. You have to stick with it when you're building up your lurkers.
Oh my gosh, I love the lurkers. And Jeff, I'm pretty sure you're going to be episode 8. So lucky number 8. Woohoo! We made it to 8. All right, I'm going to switch gears. I want to talk about a recent podcast episode that you launched, and it was titled The Period Post Pandemic. What is that?
Yeah, honestly, it was one of the most meaningful podcasts. Meaningful because I so want people to be talking about this. And again, I know I've got the energy of a 28-year-old, but I've been in business for 40 years and I've seen this time and time again because the pandemic was not my first rodeo, my first crisis rodeo. I mean, I was living in New York City when 9/11 happened, and I was serving the wealthiest people in the country as a photographer when the recession happened, which was devastating to that socioeconomic group. So this pandemic, I said it's my third rodeo. I was like, okay, I get it. This is what we're in for. And in every time, in every crisis, people talk about the crisis ad nauseum, right? I mean, just all you hear about is the crisis, right? Then people start talking about post crisis. Post pandemic was like a buzz term. But what nobody talks about is the period post crisis. In this case, the period post pandemic. That actually is the most tender point there is. And we're in it right now. Let's first, before we relate that to business, just look around at your friends. How many people are emotionally struggling right now and you wonder why? Because hey, we're past it, right? We're post pandemic. We should be fine. Why would you be emotional now? Why would you be stressed out now? This is reality, and nobody wants to talk about it. The period post crisis is so important that we talk about it because it's we go through these stages, right? We manage if you're lucky enough to have come out on the other side of the crisis, either with your life or with your business. If you're lucky enough to come out on the other side, there's a moment of euphoria because you survived the thing, right? But the period post crisis is the PTSD of it. It's the trauma that comes afterwards. And people don't talk about this. And that's why, like I said, if you just look at it on a personal level, so many people are suffering right now emotionally with additional stress. They're burning out. They're questioning their lives. They're questioning what they do for a living. There's so much questioning going on right now. Now, you take that to the business side, business goes through a similar cycle. If you were fortunate enough to survive the crisis, you're now on the other side of it when now you're finding out if you're still relevant. You may have pushed your way through to survival, but in the period post crisis, this is when the world is going to let you know whether you positioned yourself to succeed on the other side. This is when the world is going to tell you whether they still want what you have to offer. And it's a very tender time. And that's why if you look at, for example, the Great Recession, from 2008, 2010 or so, there was a little bounce back in about 2010, 2011. And then in 2012, businesses were going out of business in droves. Classic example of you survived the thing, but you went off the cliff on the other side. So that's why I want to talk about this more now. And I'm glad you're bringing it up because the first step, if you will, to overcoming the period post crisis, and in this case, the period post pandemic, the first step is awareness. Like it is for any change in life, personal development or business change. The more we can let people know that they're not alone, the more we can let people know that this period post crisis is a real thing, that your business is facing it, that you're emotionally facing it. The more you can know it's a real thing and have awareness of it, the easier it will be to weather it. Right. So I think that's why I want to be talking about it more. Which is why I did that episode. I plan on writing some articles on it because I don't see anybody bringing this up.
When I think about the beginning of 2023, we saw the Great Resignation. Companies did major hiring. Now we're seeing major layoffs in different industries, but particularly tech is getting hit hard. People are talking about the recession, the economy. The period post pandemic. How is that different? Can you give us some differences there?
It's a great question. And I will speak from, as I often do, I always say I speak from the trenches, not from a PhD or an MBA, or in this case, I'm not an economic expert, but I'm a pretty solid life expert at this point. And I say that because, I always look at the cycle of my life. I was a terribly shy kid, well into my 20s. And then I became a photographer, both of which are about observation. And if I have to say I have any superpower, like I am a masterful observer. I spent 20 plus years not participating in life, but observing it. Right. And then as a photographer, that's literally the nature of being a photographer is observation. So I speak from in the trenches and say, hey, this is what I've observed. And this is where I'm going to speak from. So, economically, I mean, recessions are, if you look at it, in its literal form, a recession is an economic impact. Um, but what people overlook is the emotional impact on the economic impact. And to me, the 2000 and the recession was a great example of that. I actually believe a lot, and there are a lot of economic reasons and that point to why there was the Great Recession. But I think a lot of it, because of the clientele I worked with, the most affluent people in the United States, their buying patterns shifted after 9/11. A huge segment of our society, the biggest financial drivers, who prior to 2001 were incredibly materialistic, incredible consumers of anything and everything they didn't need. And hey, you know what? I benefited from that. I branded and built a business as Jeffrey Shaw, the photographer that all rich people had to have, right? And that was an intentional brand image I built because that was the thinking. Well, 2001 comes and 9/11 comes along, and that very same financially driving clientele reevaluated their lives and realized that people matter more than things. Those that walked out of those towers, their lives were forever changed. I saw my clientele downsizing in droves, and not because they couldn't financially support it. They just looked at their 20, 25,000 square foot homes and finally asked why. And they started downsizing just to live more appropriately. And I saw this firsthand because I was the photographer, and this is how it relates also to brand messaging. Up to that point, I built the business as an exclusive photographer. Well, after 9/11, exclusivity had a negative connotation to it now. So I no longer built my image on the exclusive photographer because now you just sounded like a snob. Now you sounded misaligned with people's values. Okay. So my brand messaging had to shift. So my feeling is in 2001, 2002, the years following 9/11, you had a major shift in the emotional component of financial drivers in this country. You had a huge shift in values where people wanted to consume less, that it tanked the economy. That's why, I mean, again, also all the inappropriate behavior that led up to the crash was built on people who had misaligned values. And when their values became better aligned, life wasn't working anymore and things crashed. So I always go back to, and this is the, again, period post pandemic, the difference between businesses that will survive now and those that won't. The Honestly, in a blunt way, the difference is between those that acknowledge the world has changed and those that are trying to get back to some normal, trying to get back to where they were. And that's what's going on with companies. To me, this is why you're seeing the great resignation. It's like if you're trying to go back to a business model where you force your employees to work every day in the office with set hours, good luck. It's not the reality of employees today. It's not the reality. That's what people have been asking for decades, but it took the crisis to say, I'm not going to put up I want to live my life the way I want to live it now. And I can fit in this job. The way I look at it is, and I speak a lot in HR, and this is something I say at my HR events, is that people today aren't looking for a job they can fit a life they can fit into their job. They want a job they can fit into their life.
And that's where some of the misalignment seems to be
Correct.
happening right now, right?
Correct.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
You know what this kind of reminds me of? I went on a tour of a winery in downtown Los Angeles, and there's only one winery in downtown LA, and it was the only one that stayed open during Prohibition. All of the other local alcohol related industries shut down because the law told them to. And then this winery stayed open under the radar illegally, right? And then Prohibition ends, and that winery is the only one that's positioned and ready to serve thirsty patrons. So, outside of operating illegal speakeasies and making moonshine, what can business owners and leaders do to get us through this period post
Yeah.
pandemic?
Well, and great example, by the way. I love that. And you said you used the word position, and this is my statement lately: is you need to position yourself for recovery. Now, ideally, you position yourself for recovery before going into the thing, right? So if there's a recession, and by the way, I was at an event recently with some very top level US economists, and one of those individuals said, "We're not heading into a recession." He said, we're heading into a soft landing. But this is one of the top Economic experts in the United States said we're not going into recession, we're going into a soft landing. Okay, but I will say something's coming, right? Some kind of, so the best thing you can do is position yourself for recovery. How do you do that? This is what nobody wants to hear. This is the advice nobody wants to hear. In order to position yourself for recovery, you probably have to be hiring consultants and coaches and professionals right now. And nobody wants to do that because everybody's thinking, oh, but what I've been told is that when we're going into an economic downturn, that I should pull back, that I should hold on to every penny. Nobody has ever gotten rich holding back money, right? Nobody has ever gotten rich cutting expenses that I know of. The way people get rich and the way businesses succeed, you invest and you move forward. You position yourself. I don't know anybody who's on an individual basis anyway. I don't know anybody who's ever become wealthy by cutting expenses because there's only so much you can cut. So honestly, the bet if you're going to truly position yourself for recovery and not have to deal with the post recovery period, right now is the time to invest in experts. Experts in your marketing, experts in your brand messaging. Get your website better than it has ever been so that you're positioned to outshine everybody else. That is the difference maker. Whether you are willing to invest in getting the professional support you need now to position yourself for recovery, because when the recovery comes, first of all, there's a message of supply and demand here. The reality is that so many people in all our industries will go out of business because they didn't position themselves for recovery. They weren't prepared. That the demand for your services is likely to increase at a time when there's fewer people supplying that service, right? So if you're positioned for recovery, you have just given your business steroids. This is not the time, and it drives me crazy because this is what companies do, right? The first thing they do is kill the budgets, kill the marketing budgets, kill the consultant budget. It's some board mentality that makes absolutely no sense to the real business world. The best that you can do right now is invest in moving your business forward so that you're positioned, because you'll make it through the event. You'll make it through. The difference is, though, because you invested, you're going to be positioned for recovery and you're going to come flying out of that crisis in the period post the post period crisis.
This sort of reminds me, when we were going through our quarantine and then we were able to dine out again, the restaurants were so packed. You couldn't get a reservation. They were booked out. The poor service staff was so overworked and understaffed. And it really is interesting to see which ones diversified and innovated and kept their staff. Like,
Sarah, that's such a good example. Okay, but you just laid out the whole sequence, right? But what about the restaurants that let their whole staff go?
yes,
Okay. They weren't positioned, they had no staff. So then what happens is people that used to frequent that restaurant go back to that restaurant. The quality is not as good. The service is terrible. They stop going.
right.
That's a business that goes out of business.
And when you think about some of the loyal patrons that kept ordering takeout and supporting them, buying gift cards, I think it's interesting how restaurateurs and managers treated the people that kept them in business during the downturn.
Yep.
It's really interesting to see how all of that ecosystem works. And I'd be interested from a business to business type of environment, where do you suggest decision makers go for support? How can they find these types of specialists that you're speaking of?
How can you find them? I mean, referrals are always great, but I personally, I'm always looking for the needle in the haystack. Like I love to find for myself. So I do a fair amount of research, so I would suggest do some research. Podcasts like this are a fascinating resource. I've hired many people that I've heard
Mm-hmm.
on podcast, and actually even more so, I've probably hired a lot of people that I've had on my show as guests. Right? They came on as a guest, and I felt like their area of expertise was better than anything I had heard. And
Right.
um, so I would say, yes, referrals is common, but I don't know. I actually don't think it's necessarily the best or most interesting way to find business, because there's somebody out there that may be completely unknown to you right now or unknown to your peers that's a rock star.
One of the themes that I've heard throughout this conversation is just alignment of values. And when I hear people like yourself as a guest on a podcast, I think, oh, they're speaking my love language. I want to align myself with that type of person. And that's been one of my favorite parts about self-employment is I get to pick who I want to work with. And it's something that I think and hope is going to be much more prevalent in the evolution of business moving forward.
Yeah.
I so appreciate your time today, Jeff. Your insights were so valuable. And I want to end on a really happy, exciting thing. You have an upcoming holiday that we're about to celebrate this year. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Actually, I think the timing will be amazing considering the period post-pandemic. So this is crazy. So I'll give a little background story. So the event is National Self-Employed Day, which is May 4th. The inaugural year is May 4th, 2023. But the way that came about is just this fantastic story. So on May 4th of 2022, I happened to be in New York City on business, and it turned out, I think about 6 or 7 of students of the Self-Employed Business Institute also happened to be in New York on May 4th, 2022, which is crazy, right? I think 2 people live in New York City, but 5 others were just crossing. Like, one was from Germany. She's a student of the Business Institute. She was getting an award somewhere else in the country and was spending some time in New York City. So 7 of us ended up in New York City on May 4th, 2022, which happened to be the 1-year anniversary of the launch of my book, The Self-Employed Life. So I threw a dinner party. And at the dinner party, 2 of the students showed up with a made up proclamation proclaiming May 4th as National Self-Employed Day. And it struck me in a way I thought, I wonder if this could be official. So I applied to what is the national calendar and I submitted an application to make May 4th from this point on declared National Self-Employed Day. And it got accepted. So
Oh my goodness, that's incredible.
it's an officially, it's, I said, as I say, you're not going to get the day off from work, but you're self-employed. You can take the day off. So May 4th of this year, for the inaugural year, I'm holding a 4-day event in Miami, which includes a proclamation ceremony, dinner at the sexiest restaurant in Miami, a sunset cruise, and a day and a half of coaching. So it's going to be a really blast.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I am very grateful for this conversation. I cannot wait to celebrate May 4th. I'm taking the day off. And I appreciate the lens that you shed on how we can support clients going through this period. I think that it was really insightful, probably things people hadn't thought of in the past. So appreciate your insights there. How can people find you if they want to reach out?
So in fact, if you are self-employed, and I know many listeners may not be, but if you happen to be or are thinking about it, I have a really good assessment that I've had created. It's a custom algorithm. You can get that at selfemployedassessment.com. Again, that's selfemployedassessment.com. If you are in corporate and you're thinking about maybe wanting to leave corporate, I've also created a timeline, which you can get at selfemployedready.com. And it is a quick download PDF of what you need to do month by month, 12 months prior to leaving your corporate job. That's what I coach. Most of what I coach at a one-to-one basis are people leaving corporate to become self-employed. So I've put together this document that lays out. Now, you may or may not have 12 months, but it's a 12-month timeline. So if you're 6 months away from leaving your corporate job, you may just have to speed up the pace a little bit. But at least you know all the boxes are ticked before you leave your job, and that's what's important.
Those are incredible resources, and we'll put that in the show notes along with jeffreyshaw.com. I cannot wait to see what you do next, Jeff. You always inspire me, and it's fun to see what type of dots you're connecting and pulling levers. I love it. So thank you so much for your time. I enjoyed it, and I'm sure we'll talk soon.
Me too.
Thank you so much for listening to the Prospecting on Purpose podcast. If you loved what you heard today, subscribe to the podcast and please rate and leave a review. For more info on me, or if you'd like to work together, feel free to go to my website, saramurray.com. On social media, I'm usually hanging out at Sara Murray Sales. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you next time.